Foreign Interference Bill 2017 and a related bill in committee.
In the National Security Legislation Amendment, Espionage and Foreign Interference Bill of 2017, and the question is that the bill stand as printed. Senator Bartlett.
Thank you, Chair. Just continuing on with trying to get some clarity from the Minister, and appreciate his contributions to date, about just what the meaning of some of the wordings and the concepts in this legislation will be. And I'd like to go, it's actually something I referred to in my second reading contribution this morning, where Mr Hastie specifically singled out Julian Assange and using this term, this concept of radical transparency as opposed to just general transparency. And this is, I mean, it's relevant for the entire community, I should say, but it's particularly relevant for journalists. But as we all know, the concept of journalism and citizen journalism is something that is itself a fluid one, and within that context, concept is one of people wanting to ensure adequate transparency. And as I said in my second reading contribution, in a more general philosophical sense, the issue of adequate transparency of the activities of intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies, not just our own, of course, but our allies that we work in with very, very, very closely, is a key one. It's a contestable one, which people will have different views about what is an adequate degree of transparency, but hopefully there is a recognition that there does need to be some degree of transparency. But I guess my initial question goes to that idea of where is that line in regards to radical transparency, and is there an actual explicit, given that Mr Hastie specifically referred to Julian Assange, is there actually an explicit focus on the activities of him and his organisation?
Minister.
The answer is no.
Senator Bartlett.
Well, okay. The answer is no to my second question. Thank you to that. So the first part of the question, about this concept of radical transparency as opposed to general transparency, because it was in the context of an interview between Mr Hastie and a journalist who, not surprisingly, was interested to know where the line is about not just what they can expose directly, but should any organisation such as WikiLeaks or Edward Snowden or The Intercept or any of these organisations that are focused on this release information, where are the risks for the journalists about them reporting these things? They haven't been the ones that have put them in the public arena, but if there's been an act of radical transparency, what risk is there for others in reporting about the content that's been released under the radical transparency?
Minister.
Look, obviously that term you refer to is not something that's in the bill, but the offences in the bill have been very carefully scoped to ensure that they target harmful conduct. And so a couple of important points to make. So with the exception of secrecy offences, it's not appropriate to carve out journalists from the application of most of the offences. For example, the espionage offences apply where a person intends to or is reckless as to whether their conduct will prejudice Australia's national security or advantage the national security of a foreign country. There must also be a link to a foreign principle. Now, if a journalist engaged in the relevant conduct and these circumstances existed, it would be appropriate for the espionage offences to apply. In relation to foreign interference, it's necessary for the prosecution to prove that the person's conduct is covert or deceptive, involves a threat to cause serious harm, or involves a demand with menaces. Alternatively, a person must be seeking to exert undisclosed influence over another person. The secrecy offences are, however, an exception. For these offences, a specific defence is available to journalists, reporting in the public interest. So this defence will apply where a person dealt with or held information in a person's capacity as a person engaged in reporting news, presenting current affairs, or expressing editorial content in news media, where the person reasonably believed that dealing with or holding the information was in the public interest. And the defence covers a range of staff, including legal, editorial and other administrative support staff engaged in news reporting in media organisations. The defence extends to communication, holding, removing or otherwise dealing with information to allow journalists and other staff to undertake a range of activities that are necessary in the course of their work. We believe the journalist defence strikes an appropriate balance between deterring the covert and deceptive activities of foreign actors and recognising the critical role of journalists in informing debate that is in the public interest.
Senator Bartlett.
Thank you for that. So, in regards to the details there that you spoke about, and usually when people hear the words you've talked about, and people think about, well, that's about, you know, spy activity between various governments and giving basically secrets that would be of advantage to other governments to use against us. But one of the aspects of this legislation that many people have voiced concern about is the fact of how it can flow over into economic interests, not just government economic interests, but corporate economic interests. And to use again those examples of exposure of things we've seen, of exposure of, for example, trade treaties or draft trade treaties. So if somebody was to reveal the content of a trade treaty, and we all know from debates in this place how much concern there was about a very large the Trans-Pacific Trade Treaty not being able to be made public. Would that being made public trigger the sorts of definitions or details that you've described just then?
Minister.
Thank you. It does come back to the earlier discussion, which was in relation to all of those elements, and in those circumstances there would have to be an intention or recklessness as to, I think in that case intention, but intention or recklessness in relation to damaging Australia's national interests.
Senator Bartlett.
I'm certainly not intending to go over words and definitions and specific examples that have been covered previously, and I know there's firstly a series of amendments and secondly some other questions that others may wish to ask before we do get on to the amendments. But I think we do need to, for the sake of as much confidence as possible, have as much certainty as possible about that aspects of things like making something available. So when we're talking about people making something available, it seems to be continually falling back on whether or not that's done recklessly. Is that simply the core factor that's involved, that people just need to have enough awareness about what they're doing in making information available by whatever means? Don't really want to get into whether it's through particular applications or through the internet, or whatever. Is that the core factor there that really it would boil down to, is whether or not people are being reckless in regards to this?
Minister.
The information would have to be of a certain character. They'd have to be reckless as to that, as well as making it available, as well as the issues around damage. So it's not your question appears to suggest that if someone acts recklessly, they are somehow going to potentially offend against these provisions. That is not the case. There is, and at the risk of repeating myself, I have stepped through a number of times the fact that there are a number of different elements to an offence, and depending on the offence, we are talking about either the mental element or the fault element of intention or recklessness would apply. But simply, to answer your question very simply and straightforwardly, simply being reckless is not enough. It's certain types of information, it's the use of that information, and fault elements right across the board.
Senator Rhiannon.
Thank you. Minister, I just want to explore